a place where it is valuable. And so you don't always need to seek out someone else's perspective or help to elevate you. Perhaps you can provide insight that they're looking for, and there is mutual opportunity for growth. That's where real change actually it starts. And that's where relationship building becomes genuine, intentional, and lasting, where you're both bringing something to the table. And I think that that's the opportunity that we have for crossing bridges, right? It's when, we could talk about this all day, right? All of the people that we have in our lives that don't look like us, that if we were sitting down at dinner or for lunch, people would walk up and wonder, what are they doing with each other? Right? Or they get together. Because of these kinds of things where unlikely individuals are connected because of a common interest or goal, or perhaps there's an opportunity to fill a gap that exists. Now, I will say that without conversation and interest, many times those gaps are not realized. Right. So if you're, I'm Sabrina, I grew up in a community, well, we lived in a lot of different neighborhoods, but that I can remember around the relationship building time in life, I was living in Garfield. A community that has since been pretty much gentrified. But I was living in Garfield, and during a time in the 90s when there were gangs, and I was afraid to walk up and down the street sometimes because you just never know what was going on. But in the summertime, young kids from our community were walking down to a summer job because of a relationship that we built with a community leader who has literally created opportunities for me to build relationships that I just never could have imagined. But what's always stuck with me is his response to his relationship with me, how much I've provided and poured into him, the types of investments that I've been able to make in him because of my perspective, because of the things that I've experienced and the way that I've changed the way that he thinks and feels and behaves, and makes decisions.
Okay.
So we can't forget what we bring to the table in any instance.
Yeah. That actually takes me back to one of our first conversations, which I feel like may have turned into a little bit of a soapbox moment, because I felt like I spoke a little bit longer in our first meeting than I ever anticipated, meeting over Starbucks that time. But you talked about fear, and you mentioned that for a second. And when you said fear and then talked about the power of like knowing what you bring to the table, the term imposter syndrome is what really popped into my head. And I don't want to skip over that because I feel like, a number of people that are listening, deal with that on a regular basis. I know, it's something that earlier in my career, I had to deal with, before I got into, some of the roles that I got later on. And also, not that I don't want to talk about young people, because I feel like Gen Z and whatever the generation is that our children are a part of, and those generations are very important. But I also have a significant passion for millennials and Generation X, because I feel like that an age range for me that's always in my head is kind of like this 30 to like 45 kind of age range where you have a decent amount of experience, maybe not exposure, to higher levels of things, but, are very good at what you do, or, have just lived life and various things have happened, but you're at a crossroads, relatively speaking, and are still extremely young, right? 30 to 45 is really, really young. But when you talked about fear, how have you throughout your career, coming from where you come from and all of that, really, what are some things that you've done to, positive self-talk, get to know yourself more? A saying that I always like to, express to people is that I don't believe that anyone is fearless. But really, more of the people that I know just make a choice to be courageous, right? And you can make that in a second. Okay, I'm going to be courageous and I'm going to speak up in this meeting. We talked about it a couple episodes ago as we were talking about personal integrity, right? And how can you, influence that? So talk to me a little bit more about, fear. You smiled about it, so maybe imposter syndrome was what you were referring to a little bit, but can we talk about that, and specifically as you're thinking about like working professionals that maybe once again come from similar backgrounds and all of that, but what are some things that you did to actually overcome that?
So let's be clear about where it comes from first.
Okay.
And that's what I was alluding to a bit. I would say that idea of imposter syndrome. So let's be clear. I'm a part of that age range that you mentioned, where
Really? I didn't know that.
Oh, right. So, so the age range where you have, a bit of experience, but in the professional realm, depending on sector, you are still considered rather young. And as a CEO, and this is the third time that I've run a company. I turned 40 this year, and I have many times always been, and let's go ahead and run it down, right? The only. We have this conversation, I would say, over dinner or wherever, right? We've talked about this, but the only, right? So invited to the meeting, the only young Black woman, or the only Black person, the only young person, the youngest person on the committee, the young CEO, the youngest person leading a department, the only person present in the room. Mistaken for the secretary, or confused because I was being referred to as the admin in conversations where people didn't expect to see me at the table, or didn't understand why I was invited, or what role I could play, or how I could contribute. So imposter syndrome, this idea of self-doubt, considering over and over what your competence is truly and what you bring to the table, I would say for me, right, based on my identity and all of the things that I've mentioned, where I'm from, my experience, the things I've experienced in that particular space, is created by, one, the bias that exists, the way that I've been interacted with, the way that I've been approached, experiences that I've had where my competence, my position, my ability have been questioned, have not only been questioned, but have been disregarded. And so it takes a toll, right? Where you're constantly feeling like in certain professional spaces, you're required to prove that you belong in the room.
Yeah.
Right. Even when you are hosting the conversation in said room, that is your room.
Yeah.
And so there's that part where it's embedded in the daily life where you're battling, and so it causes you to question. At least for me.
Yeah.
Like goodness.
Quick interjection, because I mean this is awesome. One of the things that I've done, and for our listeners, once again, just something practical. Sabrina just said something that I hope you all don't miss. But, she said, feeling like things are happening, right? Or people are saying this or anything. And one of the big things that I had to, move past and deal with, and thankfully, this is another reason why we have coaches and mentors and all that kind of stuff, right? But to really take the time to process what people have said and or didn't say, because I know that personally I have felt different kinds of ways about how people maybe said something or tone or anything, and then my mind literally just started running with different feelings or how I felt, and to be able to recognize that my feelings are real, but whether or not individuals actually said something or maybe were implying something else, at least for me it was, how can I had to basically step away from that and say, well, if they didn't say it or implied it, then what do I know about myself am I intelligent? Am I qualified to be here? Have I done this, work before? Am I experienced? Frankly, do I have the vision and drive and work ethic, to make it work? And when the answer to all of those things are yes, then at times I've had to actually just push my feelings to the side and understand that, like, that's my feelings. No, no, Donnie, that's your feelings. That's not what people said. And so if you feel a certain way, maybe one of the first places you should check in is actually, once again, with yourself, which is, going back to kind of circling back to what you were saying before and understanding the value that you have. Because I think often, like, people overlook their feelings because we all have feelings. We're people. So we should acknowledge them. But who do we check in with first, as opposed to giving people power over how we feel?
And it's also a part of your emotional intelligence, right? I think you mentioned a bit earlier about knowing self and being very clear about who you are and spending time getting to know who you are. And perhaps even this podcast is essentially also about who you want to be, I think, as well.
Oh, goodness. Absolutely. Yeah.
So you make a really important point, but I wanted to frame the environment for this fear, because some of it is the environment, some of it is you, right? Some of it is perhaps doubting yourself just because of perhaps the things that you believe about yourself, what you're telling yourself about, if you deserve to be in a particular space or not. And I think the reality is this: when you show up, be sure to show up ready to deliver in the best way that you know how, regardless of the environment. But always be sure to communicate things so that whomever else steps in after you, maybe they don't have as difficult as a time, not just exploring, but excelling in that particular space. Not been afraid, when talking about fear, to communicate very clearly when someone has said something that made me feel uncomfortable. That's important, because me expressing my feeling creates an opportunity for dialogue and for learning, and also, right? And so whether I've been the only one, it's important for me to acknowledge it, whether or not it's seen, but to acknowledge my personal opinion, that it's important to acknowledge it, whether someone else does it or you do it, so that the next time that this meeting happens, you are not the only one. That the environment can change based on what you observe and how you feel it, how you experience it. The environment can change for the better, and you become, I believe, more confident in the way that you move and your reason for being there, reason for contributing, for being invited, things of that nature. I still say, I'll jokingly say, out of a little bit of nervousness, sometimes I'll jokingly say things like, how did I get invited to this room, or what have you? And that's me being real. Right? That's me being real and living my truth, where sometimes I do have to question, like, looking around the room, how in the world did I get invited to this conversation?
Man, that's how I feel about having you as a guest on the podcast. How were we able to get this clear pioneer, person who has no problem being first in all these rooms on the Only Dream Big podcast? We're definitely really excited to have you. So, I mean, something else just hit me, Sabrina, which I'd love for you to touch on as well. So, we're talking more about the individual, right? But as we think about some of the people around the room, right, and we talked about generational differences, and obviously, race and, gender, and, all of these different demographics, right? Can you pause for a minute and speak to those people who, maybe are not, the same generation? Maybe they're older, maybe they're younger, maybe they're white male, maybe they're white female, maybe they're something else, in how they identify. And so can you speak to, some of those folks who, once again, aren't necessarily the individual, but what are ways that they could potentially communicate differently maybe some thoughts or feelings or